Hello everyone, in this video I will be recapping from the chapter 63 to 67 of the Manhwa Revenge of the Iron-Blooded Sword Hound. The same night, Vicar returned to the main house and went to Chihuahua's office. With a happy expression, he congratulated him for entering through the main door this time and not like last time when he entered through the window. Chihuahua looked at Vicar and called him Deputy Consul. He leaned against the wall and put his hand on his forehead. A bit nervous, he asked the secretary a question. Outside the building, there were many people gathered, staring at the window where Vicar was. He asked Chihuahua the reason why so many people were gathered around the building. Chihuahua informed him that the news of Deputy Consul's return had spread throughout the empire, and he also explained that all those people had come to personally welcome the Deputy Consul. Vicar, somewhat nervous, put his hand on his head and explained to Chihuahua that he was tired. At that moment, the office door started to slowly open. Pomeranian opened the door and entered the office, calling Vicar Dad. He approached her and caressed her head, reminding her once again that he was not her father but her uncle. With a pleasant smile, Pomeranian nodded and then showed him a white mouse she had in her hands, explaining that its name was Baba. She also explained that she had caught this mouse all by herself. Upon seeing the state of the mouse, Vicar told her that it was a cute dead mouse and advised her to be careful as she could catch the Black Plague. Vicar stood up and then looked at Secretary Chihuahua and asked if the issues of the needy had been resolved. Chihuahua responded that, thanks to his presentation to Cindy Wendy last time, things were resolved successfully. He also mentioned that she was highly efficient in accomplishing tasks. Chihuahua opened a drawer and somewhat worriedly informed him about a case even Cindy Wendy could not find a clue for, leaving Vicar somewhat shocked. He took out an envelope called F10 and placed it on the table and explained that lately children from the marginalized neighborhoods had been disappearing one after another. According to Chihuahua, it wasn't a case of kidnappings, since the parents of the missing children hadn't been contacted, and the intention behind the abductions was also unknown as it had nothing to do with the black market. He also added that it couldn't have been the work of a monster, as all the children disappeared without leaving a trace. Vicar opened the envelope and began reading the information, while Chihuahua explained that although there was no physical evidence, he believed it was done by a criminal. Chihuahua, noticing that Vicar wasn't responding, reprimanded him, and as he read the reports, he started to become furious. He thought to himself that an incident in which numerous children disappeared in the city of Underdog. He realized that the content was similar to the false accusation against him. So he thought that would happen in the next decades, and quickly realized that this had something to do with what was happening right now. While he was lost in his thoughts, Pomeranian caught his attention. He turned around and asked Pomeranian not to bother him since he was busy. While she had the live mouse in her arm, she revealed that the mouse had survived, leaving Chihuahua and Vicar speechless. Vicar asked Pomeranian if she had brought the mouse back to life. While she looked at the mouse, she answered yes. She began to play with the mouse, and Vicar put his hand on his chin and thought to himself that this was clearly corpse reanimation, a black magic that could be performed using negative mana. Vicar approached Pomeranian and asked her since when she had learned to do something like this. The mouse climbed onto Pomeranian's head and she began to count her fingers, and she replied that it had been 3 nights ago. She explained that she had observed what the people of the tribe were doing and started to imitate them. Vicar, somewhat astonished, stared at her and thought that he had discovered Pomeranian in a village of the Lakoko tribe. He began to wonder if it could be that she had learned black magic and necromancy from the Lakoko tribe on her own. The children of the Baskerville and Morg families, who were said to be home to only geniuses, who barely felt mana until the age of 8. In comparison, Pomeranian could use negative mana, which was challenging for a 5-year-old child to respond to. She was a magical genius in the blood of the Baskerville family, and also born as a genius of black magic. Vicar began to wonder how Hugo would react to this. He imagined the worst-case scenario where Hugo, upon finding out that she used black magic and that the blood of a barbarian was mixed in, decided that they couldn't let her live. While Vicar was petting Pomeranian, he thought it would be obvious to that cold-blooded person, so he decided it was better not to confront him. At that moment, a messenger pigeon began to approach the window of Chihuahua's office. Upon reading the message, he was shocked and quickly informed to Vicar that they were in big trouble. A confused Vicar turned around and asked Chihuahua what was happening. He pointed to the paper where the message was written and with a trembling voice revealed that the head of the family was going to come to the main house in person. At that moment, the head of the family slowly got out of his carriage and started moving towards the main house, while Chihuahua was revealing to Vicar that Hugo was going to arrive soon in the city of Underdog. Hugo entered the main house and sat down to talk in front of Vicar, while Chihuahua and Hugo's butler stood behind their chairs, creating tension in the atmosphere. After several minutes, Hugo decided to break the tense atmosphere by asking Vicar if he had returned, to which he responded that he was indeed back. Chihuahua felt relieved to see that someone had finally broken the tension in the atmosphere. Vicar looked to the side and thought to himself that because Hugo had returned, he quickly took Pomeranian to the next room and began to pray that nothing would happen. Hugo asked Vicar how he had been, and he replied that while he was in the deep forest, he lived with the barbarians and focused on recovering from his injuries. He also added that in the process, he pretended to be friendly and identified the barbarians in order to devise a plan to eliminate them. Upon hearing this, Hugo was somewhat surprised and asked for information about Vickers' plan. Vicker explained that he wanted to use the Empire's industrial products to control the barbarians. He also added that in the Empire, cheap glassware, woolen items, vegetables, and grain were considered valuable to them. So he explained that if he used these, he could effectively control them. Hugo, somewhat confused by Vicker's explanation, responded that this was called trade and not a way to suppress them. Vicker explained that in this process, blood would be shed by the barbarians. With an evil look and aura, Vicker also added that he planned to demand their submission of monsters in exchange for industrial products. Hugo touched his beard and began to think that it was a good idea. He also started wondering if it was possible to expand his territory by shedding the blood of the barbarians. So, with a smile and an evil aura, he thought that it was a wonderful solution since, after all, he was his son. Vicker informed him that he had already built the infrastructure. Upon hearing this, Hugo decided to leave him in charge of the trade with the barbarians. Upon hearing the conversation between Hugo and Vicker, Chihuahua was shocked and started sweating, thinking that this was the conversation of a father and a son who had reunited. Hugo's butler looked and with a tear in his eye, thought that if the patriarch was smiling like this, there must be some reason behind it. He hadn't seen him smile like this in the past 2 years since the young Master Vicker had disappeared. Vicker started to drink some tea and thought to himself that he didn't want the people of Balak to suffer because of the Baskerville family. From the perspective of the Baskerville family, it seemed like the natives were dying as they eliminated the monsters, but in reality, they were only returning to where the madam was. He wanted to avoid a confrontation with Baskerville and buy time to increase Balak's power. Hugo, who was unaware of the existence of the madam, would think that the natives would easily accept this without realizing that their enemy, the forest natives, were increasing their powers. At that moment, Hugo placed his teacup on the table, and Vicker and Chihuahua started staring at him intently. Suddenly, the tea in the cup started heating up to very high temperatures, then Hugo became furious and told Vicker that they were not going to trade with the Lakoko tribe. Then, with an angry expression, he told him that he himself was going to annihilate that tribe and asked him to take note of this. The soul of Chihuahua began to escape from his mouth out of fear. Vicker, feeling nervous, responded to Hugo with a yes. Then he started to wonder if Hugo still held a grudge against the Lakoko tribe. Thinking about this, he thought that this was another reason why he shouldn't let him meet Pomerian. Hugo put his hand on his head and said aloud that it had been a long time since he had seen his son, but now it seemed that all he had been doing was saying bad things about the barbarians. He asked Vicker not to exceed the front line again, leaving him somewhat surprised. Hugo also explained to him that after saving Morg's daughter and disappearing, they were able to obtain a great diplomatic benefit from the Morgs. Hugo also mentioned that the imperial family learned about this emotional story, and now they thought highly of the Knights of Baskerville. Despite everything that had happened, for a father who lost his son, everything was meaningless, as getting things in exchange for losing a son had no value. Hugo asked Vicker again to try not to strain himself too much from now on. Upon hearing this, Vicker couldn't help but think of the word pretense, as before returning, the night he escaped after being falsely accused, he felt the sensation of a sword piercing his back. And the cold stares of the bloodhounds, with whom he had shared joys and sorrows, he could instantly realize that he had been abandoned by his own master. His father didn't even give him the chance to explain, causing his fangs to not become dull from his pretense. Vicker, with a murderous look, thanked his father Hugo Le Baskerville for having been concerned about him. At that moment, Pomerian entered the room and started calling Vicker uncle, causing him and Chihuahua to start feeling the danger of the situation. She entered the room running and circled Hugo's couch to reach Vicker's couch, explaining to him that she was very afraid of the thunder. She quickly made her way to Vicker's couch and embraced him, tears streaming down her face. Chihuahua approached her and asked her that now was not the time. Vicker panicked and thought he couldn't let Pomerian and Hugo meet. In that moment, Hugo glanced at Pomerian's eyes. Then, furious, he stood up from the couch, creating tension in the room. But upon seeing Pomerian's face, he couldn't help but be struck and saddened at the same time, since her face was quite familiar to him. The swordsman with the iron blood, the owner of Baskerville, one of the 7 families of the Great Empire. Hugo Le Baskerville, the best swordsman in the Empire who expelled the barbarians far beyond the borders and also exterminated hundreds of monsters. Once Hugo decided on a direction, he never looked back. He was truly known as a man with iron blood. But now Hugo's feelings began to tremble as he saw the little girl in front of him. Hugo was speechless when he saw Pomerian's face. Pomerian hugged Vicker with all her strength and tearfully told him that she was very scared, leaving Vicker both shocked and confused at the same time. Tears streaming down her face, Pomerian looked at Hugo again, then started crying once more and told Vicar that she was very scared of that man's mustache, leaving Chihuahua speechless. Upon seeing the situation, Vicar quickly intervened and asked his father to calm down. Nervously, he also explained to Hugo that she was a little girl he had personally brought for an errand. He also explained that initially when he saw her red eyes, he thought they were a family trait, but later after investigating, he found out that she was from a border tribe. Vicar also told him that there was no chance she was someone known to their family, leaving Hugo speechless. Hugo quickly calmed down, and then put his hand on his head and thought that he had made a mistake, since if Penelope were still alive, she couldn't be the same age as the little girl. Hugo stood up and started heading towards the exit, deciding to go back home as he was quite tired. At that moment, Vicar looked at him intently and somewhat nervously asked him to be careful. He thought to himself how Hugo, a person with the soul of a sword master, was so surprised to see Pomeranian, so Vicar quickly came to the conclusion that there was definitely something there. Hugo turned around and asked Vicar to attend the grand banquet tomorrow. Upon hearing Hugo's words, Chihuahua was confused and thought to himself that the grand banquet was a dinner where only a very small number of immediate family members gathered. He also thought that the dream of every lower Baskerville was to attend the banquet. Vicar said goodbye to Hugo, telling him that they would see each other tomorrow. Just before leaving through the door, Hugo looked at Pomeranian once again, who was in Chihuahua's scared arms. That same night, Vicar placed some pillows on his bed and covered them with sheets while he lay down on the floor next to the bed. With an empty stare, Vicar thought that after washing himself with hot water and lying on the soft bed, he felt uncomfortable and couldn't sleep. He started to wonder if this was due to the influence of the 2 years he had spent with the Balak warriors. He also thought that the influence of the warriors would be ingrained in him for some time. He thought that Hugo's reaction had been quite unexpected. Based on his previous reaction to the incident with Pomeranian and the amulet, he had to make a decision. After the grand feast tomorrow, he planned to hint to Hugo that Pomeranian might prove to be a good card for him to strike a decisive blow. Either way, he had to do it in a way that wouldn't harm Pomeranian. Vicar closed his eyes to sleep, but at that moment, the curtain in his room moved. Vicar quickly realized that something was wrong. His senses did not fail him as a hooded woman entered his room. The woman slowly unsheathed her knife and approached Vicar's bed. At that moment, a voice told the woman that less than a day had passed since he had returned, but news traveled fast. Vicar placed one of his hands on the bed and, using the momentum, delivered a powerful kick to the hooded woman. The woman managed to dodge the kick at the last second, but in the process, she dropped her knife, which flew and embedded itself in the wall. In the blink of an eye, Vicar placed his hand under the hooded woman's throat, but at that moment, the woman quickly asked him to wait a minute. She began to tell him that it was just a joke. Upon hearing the woman's voice, Vicar immediately recognized her. Vicar moved closer to the woman's face and asked her to request a formal meeting from now on, as he could have accidentally killed her. The woman replied that sleeping on the floor disguised as a pillow was a strange sleeping habit. The woman slowly started to remove her mask and told Vicar that even if he died and came back to life, nothing had changed about him. After removing the mask, the woman greeted him, and Vicar looked at her and asked her not to cause a scene by calling her by her name, Sindhu Wendy. She began to approach the bed and asked Vicar if he had sent her to Chihuahua, and she also asked him how he had known that she was going with the girl who received 10 billion. Vicar began to put on his shirt and replied that trust was generated by increasing wealth. He also added that he had taken note of her behavior pattern in order to eventually ignore it all. Sindhu Wendy sat on the bed and told him that robbing him was rude. She also explained that as a financial planner, the only thing she did was receive unemployment bonuses. She also explained that if it weren't for her, all the 10 billion that Judy received would have been wasted. Vicar denied her words by telling her that bodyguards had been added to prevent that. Sindhu Wendy, somewhat confused, asked Vicar if there was no way the bodyguards could do something like that. Vicar revealed to her that financial experts had also been assigned among the bodyguards. He himself had given orders to filter various traders. Sindhu Wendy, somewhat surprised, asked if he was referring to those bodyguards. Vicar looked her in the eyes and reminded her that he himself had ordered her to let them get close. She immediately realized that Vicar had been playing her from beginning to end. As Vicar was fixing his hair, he asked Sindhu Wendy what information he had requested. She reached into her suit and pulled out envelopes with information and handed them to Vicar. Seeing this, he thought that her personality hadn't changed much in the past 2 years. He asked Sindhu Wendy to place it in the file next time and send it instead of hiding it in her suit. In exchange for this information, Vicar decided to fulfill his promise to build a bridge for trade with the natives. Sindhu Wendy replied that from now on she would have to call him boss. As Vicar looked at the envelopes, he thought to himself that these envelopes contained information about the people who would attend the banquet tomorrow. He also thought that since he had made a contribution, he hoped to be invited to the banquet. According to the information in the envelopes, the people who were going to attend the banquet were Hugo Le Baskerville, holding the patriarch rank with the status of Marquis, with the military prestige of Swordmaster. Upon seeing Hugo's envelope, Vicar thought that there was no need to check the information about him, but upon opening the following envelopes, he was shocked and asked Cindy if these people were also going to attend. The envelopes contained information about Boston Terrier Le Baskerville, with the rank of Captain of the Pitbull Knights, Senator, with the status of Count, the highest ranked military prestige according to the information. He was Hugo Le Baskerville's half-brother. He also hated being tied to any place and had a very aggressive and unruly personality. The other envelope contained information about Great Dane Le Baskerville, a captain of the Mastiff Knights and a senator. With the status of Count, the highest ranked military prestige, he was Hugo Le Baskerville's half-brother. He didn't get along with anyone, but had a particularly bad relationship with the Count, Boston Terrier. Vicar became somewhat confused upon seeing this since these people usually didn't attend family events. He asked Cindy what was going on. Cindy replied that they were coming to see the young Baskerville legend who had returned alive. She also assumed they would come to take Vicar to their nightly orders. Vicar started looking at the other envelopes and told her he was sure he would be quite tired tomorrow. Among the envelopes, he saw one that contained information about Osiris Le Baskerville, a representative with the status of Viscount and the highest ranked military prestige. He was Hugo Le Baskerville's eldest son and was currently the first heir of the family. Upon seeing this, Vicar asked Cindy if Osiris was also going to attend. She explained that Osiris was the eldest son of the Baskerville family. Growing and replicating Hugo's past, his sword skills were already on par with the 7 counts, and it was estimated that he would soon reach the level of Swordmaster. Vicar thought that before returning, he had seen Osiris several times from afar. He was a quiet and cold person who didn't even greet his subordinates or his younger siblings in the direct lineage. Cindy asked Vicar if, excluding the Patriarch and the 7 counts, Osiris would be the strongest of the Baskervilles. She began to wonder if Vicar was stronger than Osiris. Vicar advised her not to try to guess his fighting power at a glance. Among the information in the envelopes, he saw information about a person who he had heard was receiving training in a closed facility. He started wondering if this person would briefly come out to attend the banquet. This person was Set Le Baskerville, a consul of the underdog city and a member of the Chamber of Representatives. He held the status of Viscount and had an intermediate-level military prestige. He was Hugo Le Baskerville's second son and was currently the second heir of the family. His talent for sword handling was far behind his elder brothers, and he had been particularly sickly from a young age. His personality was not typical of a Baskerville, as he was gentle and kind. When he was young, Hugo would chase him for being weak. He was the only one who shed tears for the hounds that died like trash. He was the only respectable person in Baskerville. Vicar thought there must be a reason why he had to meet him. After reviewing all the envelopes, Vicar forcefully left them on the table and told Cindy that these were unexpected names. Cindy, somewhat confused and angry, explained that she had done a lot of research and also asked why he had rushed to look at them. Vicar simply replied that he knew them better than anyone else. He thought to himself that there would be a great feast tomorrow. He started staring at the envelopes and with a smile, he told Cindy that many fun things were going to happen tomorrow. The next day, Vicar began to make his way towards the Grand Banquet Hall. After several minutes, he arrived at the door of the Grand Banquet Hall, which was guarded by 2 guards who were creating tension in the atmosphere. Vicar started to approach the door and stared at it intently. After several seconds, he began to slowly open the door, further increasing the tension in the room. Upon opening the door, a bright light dazzled his face. Once the intensity of the light subsided, he saw Hugo sitting on the seat of honor. Beside him was his butler. On Hugo's left side sat his children and on his right side sat his brothers. The butler informed everyone that Vicar Van Baskerville was also going to attend the grand banquet as ordered by the head of the family. Everyone turned towards the direction where Vicar was. First Set Le Baskerville turned, who had dark circles under his eyes and looked quite tired, but despite this, he smiled at him pleasantly. Then Osiris turned, who simply looked at Vicar with one eye. Then Highborough, Middleborough and Lowborough turned, who started looking at him with admiration. Then the Great Dane turned around, who was somewhat surprised to see Vicar attending the grand banquet. And finally Boston Terrier turned around, and while resting his head on his fist simply smiled at seeing Vicar. Vicar placed a hand on his chest and closed his eyes to thank Hugo for the invitation to the grand banquet. Hugo stared at him intently, and while his eyes were shining, he called Vicar son and asked him to come to the table and sit next to his brothers. He approached and sat at the table, and the grand banquet began. First, everyone started with the main course, which was meat. They all started eating without saying a word, creating tension in the atmosphere. The servant stood behind Boston Terrier's chair and watched as the tension in the room began to increase every second. The first person to break the tension was Boston Terrier Le Baskerville, commander of the Pitbull Order. His plate had 4 pieces of sliced meat, He asked everyone if the meat was undercooked. Hugo became somewhat confused, looked at Boston Terrier, and asked him if he didn't like meat. Boston Terrier smiled and replied that it wasn't what he had meant to say. He then pointed with his hand to the person sitting next to him, who was struggling to cut the meat as it was quite raw. Boston Terrier explained to Hugo that he was referring to the meat on the plate next to him. The person sitting next to him was Great Dane Le Baskerville, commander of the Mastiff Order, who was a bit annoyed. He asked Boston Terrier what else he was dissatisfied with. Boston Terrier stared at him and replied that he had never thought he would eat raw meat. He also added that it was as if he was trying to eat his adorable nephew raw. Great Dane also stared at him and admitted that Vicar seemed cute, but reminded him that he too was his nephew, and as an uncle, it was natural to guide his nephew on the right path. Boston Terrier pointed his finger at Vicar and asked Great Dane why the right path involved throwing a child to a mastiff. Great Dane replied that this path was much better than getting involved with a stupid and boring pit bull. While Vicar looked at his uncles, he thought to himself that as expected, they had come with the intention of recruiting him. Among the 7 knights representing Baskerville, 2 of them wanted to recruit him for the Pitbull and Mastiff Knights. Before regressing, Vicar would have liked it since they were the elite with guaranteed success. While he was taking a piece of meat to his mouth, he looked at his uncles disdainfully and thought that now they simply seemed like a bunch of stray dogs. Hugo interrupted the conversation between Great Dane and Boston Terrier. Then while the butler was pouring him some wine in a glass, he explained to them that the younger brothers were always noble and arrogant, and he also added that the head of the house was happy to see them showing affection for the young master. While Vicar was watching his father drink from the glass of wine, he thought that the chief steward always gave a hopeful interpretation, and he also thought that Hugo enjoyed watching his younger brothers fight. Boston Terrier caught his attention and addressed him as his dear nephew to ask if he had spent the last 2 years in La Rouge et La Noire mountains. He also asked how many barbarians and monsters he had killed. He asked him to share his forest experiences with him. Great Dane also caught Vicar's attention to tell him that he was also concerned about knowing how his nephew had spent that time in the dangerous forest, and he also added that he was curious about his growth in the forest. Hugo interrupted the conversation and asked his brothers not to pressure him and asked them to let him eat. Great Dane asked Hugo if he felt curious, and Boston Terrier explained that he couldn't resist curiosity, so he hurried back as soon as possible to attend the grand banquet. At that moment, Hugo got angry and asked both of them that it was enough already. Upon hearing this, Great Dane and Boston Terrier felt the immense pressure coming from their older brother's words. Hugo stood up from his chair with a killer aura, and while holding a piece of meat with his fork, he reminded them again that he didn't like to say things twice. Both calmed down and decided to stop talking anymore. But at that moment, Vicar also stood up from his chair, and while looking at his 2 uncles, he explained to everyone that it wasn't difficult to prove his achievements. Upon seeing that Vicar had gotten up, Hugo looked at him and reminded him that he had traveled a long distance. He asked if it wouldn't be exhausting to make it all the way to the drill hall. Vicar looked at Hugo and replied that it was fine. Then, he extended his hand and touched the table, explaining to everyone that he could showcase his skills anytime and anywhere. He also asked them if everyday life wasn't an extension of training. He caught the attention of his uncle Boston Terrier and revealed that there was too much wine in his glass. Then, he caught the attention of his uncle Great Dane and disclosed that his steak was not well done, leaving both surprised and somewhat confused. While he was touching the table, he began to concentrate, and after several seconds, his finger started to release a bit of his mana. Vicar directed that mana towards the wine glass and the steak plate, causing the steak to cook perfectly and making sure the wine glass had the perfect amount of wine. Great Dane pierced the meat with his fork and was impressed to see that it was cooked perfectly. Boston Terrier took the wine glass and upon seeing that it had the perfect amount of wine, started laughing. Boston Terrier explained to everyone that when Vicar placed his hand on the table, he had used mana to cook the meat and heat the wine. He was surprised to see that he had reached the intermediate level of graduation at 17 years old, when normally one would reach that stage at 33 years old. He also shared his thoughts that his older brother Hugo must feel proud to have a son who had mastered all these techniques. Hugo simply drank from his wine glass and listened to the praises of his younger brother towards his son. Vicar looked towards Highborough, Middleborough, and Lowborough and thought that this was very strange because 2 years ago, he thought he had revealed his abilities as a mid-ranker graduate when he fought against Madam. He never thought that anyone would know until now. He looked at the 3 boys who were looking at him with admiration and thought they must know about his abilities. He also started to wonder why they didn't inform anyone. At that moment, someone caught his attention by calling him little brother to praise him for working very hard. The person who had praised him was Osiris Le Baskerville, first in line for succession, and the Baskerville family's eldest son. While holding his wine glass, he once again praised Vikir for doing a good job and also asked him to continue working harder in the future. Vikir, somewhat confused, thanked his older brother and began to wonder if Osiris had just praised him. Osiris was the first successor in line for the current Baskerville family and also resembled Hugo the most. Vikir still couldn't believe that Osiris was praising him. He started wondering if he was being evaluated by him. Then another person who had just placed his wine glass on the table told everyone that it was surprising to see the older brother praising his younger brother. This person was Set Le Baskerville, second in line for succession, and the Baskerville family's second oldest son. He looked at Vikir and revealed to everyone that this was the first time he had seen older brother Osiris praise someone with such a bright and joyful smile. He also told Vikir that he had a poker face just like his brother Osiris, then asked if by any chance he knew his older brothers. Vikir looked at him somewhat confused and replied that he was very aware of who his brothers were. Set looked at him, and with a joyful smile, he was glad that his younger brother knew him. He then explained that because he was very weak, he always stayed in the medical wing or at the isolation training hall. He also added that his training hall was very close to Underdog where Vikir was deputy consul. He planned to pay him a visit, so he asked if he could share his experience of the deep forest. Vikir, with a lost gaze, looked towards nothingness and thought that his bright attitude, which was very different from being a Baskerville, had not changed. During the fall, Vikir had the opportunity to serve under Set, so there were moments when they were together. In the midst of the chaos of battle, he was the only one who comforted the fallen bloodhounds. He even comforted Vikir, who was soaked in blood wandering through the battlefield. Even when Vikir was falsely accused, he remained by his side defending him until the end. With a cheerful smile, Set told Vikir that he would be under his care. Set was the only person Vikir wanted to meet at this banquet. At that moment, Vikir's expression changed drastically as he began to smell a disgusting stench that had been lingering since before. This repugnant odor was something only he could sense, as it had been present during the fall. This repugnant odor was the smell of demon. He quickly realized there was a hidden demon among the people present at the grand banquet. Vikir looked at everyone and started wondering where the source of this disgusting stench was. He closed his eyes, and after several seconds he opened them again and stared at a person. This person was holding his wine glass. He was Set, who had demon hands covering his body. He stared intently and with a smile asked Vikir, "Is there something you need?" Vikir and Set began to converse, and while they were conversing, he realized that Set was constantly engaging in conversation with everyone to lighten the mood and appear natural. While a maid was pouring some wine into Set's glass, he started asking her how she was doing. Upon seeing this, Vikir was somewhat surprised because Set wasn't just maintaining constant conversation with his siblings but also with the servants. He stared at him intently with one eye and thought that he was the same person he had met before regressing. He also began to wonder why the person he had trusted the most smelled like demons. While Set was holding his glass with one hand, he looked at Vikir and explained that when he was absent, he had heard that he had taken on the role of deputy consul of Underdog City. He also added that he had even heard that the citizens appreciated him so much that they started protesting for him to assume the position permanently. Set also told him that he was eager to work with him when he returned to his position as deputy consul. Vikir stared into Set's eyes and simply remained silent. Then, while holding the wine glass with 3 fingers, he began to bring his wine glass closer to Set's for a toast. Set looked at Vikir's wine glass with a smile. Then Vikir told him that he was also very eager to work with him. Upon hearing this, Set was delighted and they both clinked their wine glasses together in a toast, and he told him that he would be under his care. After toasting, Vikir began to bring his wine glass closer to his eye, creating a slight tension in the atmosphere. He started staring at the reflection of the wine glass, and while doing so, he saw Osiris sitting in his armchair. However, when he looked at Set's chair, he saw that it was empty. Immediately, he realized that he was unable to see his reflection in the wine glass. Upon seeing this, he began to wonder if Set was dead and a demon was possessing his lifeless body. Vikir looked at everyone present at the table and started questioning himself whether he should reveal to them all that Set was a demon. At the same time, while Set was enjoying his wine, Vikir began bringing his own glass of wine closer to his mouth and stared fixedly at Set. He changed his thoughts and decided not to reveal to anyone at the table that Set was a demon, since he thought that if he did, then his father and the others would ask him for proper evidence. Immediately, he decided that first he needed to wait for the grand banquet to finish in order to gather evidence to accuse Set of being a demon. With a pleasant smile, Set asked Vikir which order he was going to join. Smelling the odor coming from Set's breath, Vikir thought it was suffocating. Set closed his eyes and with a smile, he explained that when he was young, he thought the Doberman Order's uniform was cool. At that moment, Osiris, upon seeing Set chatting, interrupted their conversation and told Set that they hadn't finished eating yet. Then, with a piercing look, he asked him to stop bothering his brother with his insignificant talk and finish his dinner. After saying these words, Osiris began to clean up the remnants of the food with the tablecloth, and upon hearing his words, Set became somewhat nervous and decided not to continue speaking in order not to anger him. Vicar also looked at Osiris and thought to himself that now, thanks to him, he was free from the smell coming from Set's breath. Hugo caught Vicar's attention and asked how the food was. He looked at Hugo and replied that it was very good. Upon hearing this, Hugo told him that he was very happy that he was enjoying the food. He then added that he had a matter to discuss with him, and now that they were in the main house, he asked Vicar to visit his office. Vicar looked at Hugo and pondered for several seconds before responding that he understood. That same night, after finishing the grand banquet dinner, he left the main house. While walking away from the house, he sighed as he was a bit tired since the dinner had lasted 5 hours. This experience was tough for him as he never thought he would dine with those people. During dinner, he heard that the official document for the participants of the academy had arrived in Baskerville. He didn't take long to realize that the reason Hugo had summoned him was because of his enrollment in the academy. While he was lost in his thoughts, a man who was on top of the main house started staring at him. The man took advantage of Vicar's guard being down to launch a powerful sword attack, causing a red aura to quickly advance towards him. But to his surprise, Vicar immediately felt the presence of the attack, and as he looked in the direction of the attack, he realized it was the 6th technique of the Baskerville family. Realizing this, he began to wonder if he would be able to surpass it. While he was unsheathing his sword, he remembered that his revealed skill level was mid-grade graduator, which meant that he couldn't go beyond that. So without further ado, he used the 4th Baskerville technique and unleashed precise and powerful sword cuts towards the attack. The cuts started weakening the attack. Upon seeing this, he planned to absorb the remaining aura with the blessing of the river Styx and his own aura. He prepared himself to absorb the aura, but to his surprise, just before the attack could impact him, it simply disappeared. Upon seeing this, he became somewhat confused and started looking towards the roof of the main house where he saw the leg of the man who had launched the attack at him. The man began to laugh out loud. This man was none other than Boston Terrier LeBaskerville himself. With a smile on his face, he explained to Vicar that there was a 2-level difference between their techniques. Despite this, he was quite surprised to see that he had withstood his attack. Boston Terrier praised Vicar for being a true adult, then jumped down from the roof of the main house to the ground. Due to the impact, he created cracks in the floor. He said out loud that he knew his eye wasn't deceiving him and asked Dane if he thought the same way. Dane appeared behind Vicar and, upon seeing that Boston Terrier had swung his sword in the main house, told him that these behaviors were those of a barbarian. Dane stared at Boston Terrier and asked why he had tried to kill his beloved nephew. He also added that if Hugo found out about this, as punishment, at the very least he would be sentenced to several months of probation. Boston Terrier looked at Dane and with a smile, asked him how he could say these kinds of things about the love an uncle has for his nephew. He also revealed that he had adjusted the attack to disappear right before him, so he wouldn't get hurt. He also asked Dane why he didn't follow his own path and stop interfering with them, the Pitbulls. Upon hearing this, Dane corrected him by saying that Vicar belonged to the Mastiffs. He also added that as his uncle, he would not allow his beloved nephew to join a gang of thugs. While the two of them were arguing, Vicar began to sheath his sword, and meanwhile things between Dane and Boston Terrier started to heat up. Boston Terrier mocked Dane by telling him that someone who begged to be saved when he got a small cut on his belly shouldn't say these things. Dane retaliated against Boston Terrier by telling him that pit bulls were so muscular that they didn't have belly skin to tear. Both drew their swords and Boston Terrier proposed to have a duel, and the winner would take Vicar to his order. Dane accepted without hesitation since he always wanted the best for his nephew. Seeing that both were about to fight, Vicar simply turned around and started walking away from them, thinking that his uncles were quite annoying. As he was walking away, he thought to himself that the previous attack Boston Terrier had launched at him hadn't been so strong. While he was advancing towards the bridge that connected the main house with Underdog City, he thought that the strongest attack from the 7 counts was the 6th technique of the highest-ranking Baskerville grader. He himself was also the highest-ranking grader, but still knew about the 7th technique, and furthermore knew how to use the blessing of Styx River and the demonic sword Beelzebub. With a smile and a murderous look, he thought that thanks to these techniques, he could now go against 2 of the counts. After crossing the bridge, Vicar saw 3 people standing in front of him, and upon seeing this, he became somewhat confused. The people in front of him were High Burrow, Middle Burrow, and Low Burrow, who began to stare at him intently, creating tension in the air. Several seconds later, slowly but surely all 3 started unsheathing their swords. Upon seeing this, Vicar realized that this was not good. With his eyes gleaming, he began to glare aggressively at them and grew angry at the thought that they already knew the difference between their powers. And now, upon seeing that they were willing to fight despite knowing the difference in power between them and him, he thought he had no other choice but to kill the bloodhounds who showed their teeth without knowing their place. But to his surprise, instead of trying to fight, High Burrow, Middle Burrow, and Low Burrow kneeled down, lowered their heads, and placed their swords at their feet, leaving him astonished. He looked at High Burrow, and as he glanced down at his feet, he realized that they were making the promise. The promise was a position that made the knights vulnerable. In this position, one single push and their sword would penetrate through their feet. If a knight adopted this position, it meant that he was putting his life in the hands of the person standing before him. Vicar asked High Burrow, Middle Burrow, and Low Burrow what they were doing. The three stared at him and replied that they had come to pay off their debts. High Burrow explained to him that the feeling he had since he was attacked by him when he was 9 years old was fear. Middle Burrow told him that he had started to recognize him when he had hunted Cerberus, and finally Low Burrow told him that he was amazed to see that he had been able to kill the troll. The three of them explained to him that they had started to feel a sense of admiration and reverence after seeing that he had been able to confront the giant monster in the forest. They also added that on the day they barely escaped with their lives, they gathered and decided that from now on they would become the three spears of Vicar van Baskerville. They asked him to please become their master, whom they, the Bloodhounds, will serve forever. Upon hearing this, Vicar was somewhat surprised. He thought that before regressing, they were the ones who captured him and also the ones who fled after he was falsely accused. They three were called Hugo's Three Spears, and Vicar knew that they were simply bloodhounds carrying out their orders. But despite this, just because they were following orders didn't make Vicar's feelings disappear. He simply walked past the three without saying a word, and upon seeing this, High Burrow, Middle Burrow, and Low Burrow became sad. But to everyone's surprise, as he was walking away, he told them that he didn't need things like promises, and added that he was tired now, so they would talk about this later. Deep down, Vicar hadn't forgiven them, but wanted to use them at his mercy to carry out his revenge plan. With a smile, the three of them looked at Vicar and he asked them not to reveal to anyone the fact that they were now together and what would happen in the future. While he was walking away from them, the three of them responded to him that they understood. After hearing this, he simply kept walking without saying a word. He thought to himself that Set's body being taken over by demons was a variable he hadn't expected, so he thought he needed to ask Cinderwendy to investigate this matter as quickly as possible because no matter what happened, he needed to kill the demon. He began staring at Hugo's office in front of him and thought that before killing the demon, he needed to do something even more important. He went to Hugo's office, and upon entering, he said a few words that made him furious. Hugo asked what he had just said, creating such tension in the atmosphere that even the butler began to feel afraid. Hugo asked Vicar to repeat what he had just said. With a calm voice and a tranquil gaze, Vicar took a step forward and spoke again about Roxana, his deceased first wife, and the daughter between him and Roxana, Penelope. Vicar stared at Hugo and asked him if he could talk to him about Penelope. Upon hearing this, Hugo became furious and with a deadly look and aura, he asked how he knew the name of Penelope. Vicar simply looked into his eyes, and while his eyes were shining, he thought that this was only the beginning of his revenge plan. A few hours ago, when dawn broke and the sun's rays began to penetrate the windows of the house. In Hugo's office, he took out an envelope and placed it on the table, explaining to Vicar that they had received a notice from the academy. Vicar took the envelope with both hands, and while reading the notice, Hugo intertwined his fingers. As he watched his son read the notice, he decided to talk to him about the previous promise he had made regarding entering the academy. The notice letter was from Colosseo, and it was a letter specifically addressed to the students of Class 20. While Vicar was reading the notice letter, he thought that he had guessed right when he thought that the reason Hugo had summoned him was because of his admission to the academy. Colosseo Academy was the largest educational institution that the Great Rock Empire provided for students. If a student managed to graduate from the academy, then they would start the elite course at the Imperial Palace or even on an upper floor. Before regressing, Vicar attended the academy as a servant for the triplets, and back then, he had numerous scars on his face and limp, so he was disregarded by the nobles of the academy. Now that he had regressed, the bad memories of the academy didn't bother him at all. While Vicar was lost in his thoughts, Hugo caught his attention and with a smile asked him if the triplets, whom he himself had asked to go with him, would be okay. He also asked if besides them, there was anyone else that he would like to take with him to the academy. Vicar looked at Hugo and asked him that before answering his questions, he would also like to ask him something. He explained to him that 2 years ago, due to his disappearance, the head of the family received a letter indicating that he would receive a great benefit from the Morgue family, and Vicar himself would be rewarded. He asked his father if it was true that he was going to receive a reward. With a smile, Hugo replied that it was correct and also asked if there was something specific he wanted as a reward. Vicar replied that as a reward he wanted his father to share a story with him. Hugo was somewhat confused to see that he wanted to hear a simple story as a reward. As he felt very curious, he asked him what kind of story he wanted to hear. Now that Hugo had agreed to give him a story as a reward, Victor told him that he would assume that he had allowed him to ask. He approached Hugo's table and revealed that he would like to know about Mrs. Roxana and Miss Penelope. Upon hearing these two names, the butler's expression changed drastically as he couldn't believe what Victor had just asked him. Hugo's expression also changed and he asked Victor what he had just said. Victor started staring into his eyes and mentioned again the late Mrs. Roxana, his first wife, and the daughter they had together. Victor asked Hugo once again if he could talk to him about Miss Penelope. Upon hearing the name Penelope, Hugo clenched both fists and began to get angry, asking Victor how he knew Penelope's name. With a killer look, Hugo also asked him why he was asking this, and he added that if he was asking out of mere curiosity, he advised him that it would be better if he didn't. Despite the enormous pressure created by Hugo in the atmosphere, Victor simply closed his eyes and placed his hand on his chest. With a calm voice, he replied that first he needed to know his answer in order to tell him the reason why he needed to hear the story. Upon hearing this, Hugo began to get angrier and angrier, and just before his anger exploded, Victor explained to him that the reason was not mere curiosity, and also asked him to please trust him. Hugo's thoughts about his first wife, whom he met through an arranged marriage, and his eldest daughter who was kidnapped by barbarians. It was all crucial information that Victor needed to reveal Pomeranian's existence to Hugo. While Victor was heading to Hugo's office with Barrymore the butler, he told him a fairy tale that was very hard to believe. On the way to Hugo's office, Barrymore told him that he might not believe his words, but the patriarch was an affectionate man towards his family. Upon hearing this, Victor was somewhat surprised and replied that he didn't think there were many Baskervilles who believed in Hugo. Barrymore told him that the patriarch still loved his first wife, Mrs. Roxana, very much, who had passed away due to an illness. Despite hearing the story Barrymore had told him, Victor still couldn't allow Hugo to meet Pomeranian based solely on Barrymore's fairy tale. He needed to verify it for himself. Hugo remained silent for several minutes, creating tension in the air, and then decided to speak up. He placed his hand on his chest and with a sad expression, he told Victor that Roxana was his only love, whom he loved with all his heart, and Penelope was his most precious treasure. Upon hearing Hugo's words, Victor was somewhat surprised and confused at the same time. He began to wonder if the word love had just come out of his father's mouth. Hugo rested his elbows on the table and intertwined his hands. While looking at the floor, he was honest with him and revealed that he and Roxana were not in an arranged marriage since she was a commoner who had nothing. Despite many years having passed, Hugo still remembered the day they met as if it were yesterday. While both were walking through the city, they looked at each other and fell in love at first sight. Upon hearing this, Victor looked at Hugo and realized that he was starting from the first time he met Roxana. Hugo explained to him that the love between them was very difficult, as Roxana tried to distance herself from him because of her humble origin, but he gave up everything and went with her. If it were up to her, Hugo was willing to get rid of everything, not only his physical body but also his own soul. Victor had not come to listen to this story, so he thanked his father for sharing the story with him and asked if he could advance a little further in the story until Penelope appeared. Just before Victor could finish speaking, Hugo interrupted him to continue telling the story. He explained that their love was once again put to the test, since they were being chased by the Baskerville family, who wanted to capture them. In order to protect Roxana, Hugo fought for his life, and the thorny path they both traveled was one in which no one blessed their love. Many times they thought about giving up, but they were able to stay together thanks to their mutual love. And despite that being the beginning of a difficult start, both managed to overcome their parents' disagreement and got married. Upon hearing this love story, Barrymore became emotional and took off his glasses to wipe away the tears. Through their relationship, Penelope was born, his beloved wife and dear daughter. They were people he wanted to protect since he had obtained them through struggle. But unfortunately, after giving birth, Roxana's health deteriorated instantly. In the end, she couldn't fight the illness anymore and she left this world, leaving behind a young Penelope. Fortunately, she grew up to be a bright and charming girl. She inherited her father's strong mentality and her mother's loving heart. She received love from all the Baskervilles. Despite having lost his wife, Hugo was happy just knowing that Penelope was well. He was happy until that incident happened. When he remembered this event again, Hugo unconsciously let out his killer mana and grabbed the arm of the armchair so tightly that it started to break into pieces. Hugo explained that Penelope, who went out for a walk, was captured by the Lakoko tribe. He began to get even angrier and with a murderous look wondered how the barbarians had managed to enter Baskerville territory and how they had managed to kidnap Penelope, which was a fact that until today Hugo was unable to decipher. And because of this, up until now, he couldn't find any clues about Penelope. While Victor was staring at Hugo, he simply listened to his words without interrupting him. Hugo used Penelope's disappearance as justification to expand the Empire's region and started searching for his daughter by subjugating the barbarians. He felt that doing it alone was going to be difficult, so he drastically increased the number of his wives through arranged marriages and began producing offspring en masse. And decades later, although stationed on the border, Hugo created a powerful family that no one could look down upon, and thus the Iron Blood Baskerville family was born. Hugo put his hand on his head and began to lament the loss of his daughter and wife. And upon seeing this, Vicar thought that despite showing coldness to restore the family and for the glory of the Empire, behind that, he was hurt by having lost the family he loved so much. Despite seeing Hugo's true face, Vicar thought it meant nothing since all villains had a past story, and the evil acts they committed throughout life were all that remained. While Vicar was looking at Hugo with contempt, he thought that he was only a soulless human who mass-produced offspring and sent them to the battlefield. Despite thinking this way, Vicar still understood how precious Roxana and Penelope were to him. Hugo finished telling the story, and while staring intensely at Vicar with a look and a killer aura that was creating tension in the atmosphere, he told him that he had already finished telling the little story, and also asked him to now tell him the reason why he had asked about them. Vicar put his hand in his pocket and took out a golden pendant. He approached Hugo's table and placed the pendant on it, asking if he could take a look at it. Hugo started to examine the pendant and realized that it was familiar to him. As he held it in his hand and looked closely, he realized that it was the pendant he made for his wife Roxana, and it was the same pendant that Penelope was wearing before being kidnapped by the barbarians. Upon opening the locket, Hugo saw a photo of himself, Roxana, and their daughter Penelope. Upon seeing this, he began to stare at it intently, creating even more tension in the atmosphere. Vicar started to move away from Hugo's table and asked him what he would do if Miss Penelope's successor were alive. Upon hearing these words, Hugo and Barrymore were shocked. As they both watched Vicar walk towards the door with their mouths agape, Hugo asked him what he was talking about. Vicar approached the office door, and while looking at Hugo, he revealed to them that the successor of whom he was talking about was Miss Penelope's daughter. He also added that in other words, Hugo Le Baskerville had a granddaughter. At that moment, someone opened the door and entered Hugo's office. The person who had entered addressed Vicar as uncle, and upon seeing who this person was, Hugo was shocked. This person was Pomerian, who had been waiting at the door with Chihuahua. She grabbed Vicar by his clothes and told him that she had been waiting as he had asked her to. Upon seeing Hugo, Pomerian hugged Vicar's leg. Then Vicar revealed to Hugo that he had lied to him. He told him the truth by explaining that while he was in the forest, there was a girl he met in the Lakoko tribe region. She referred to the person who gave her the pendant that Hugo had in front of his eyes as mother. Upon knowing this, Hugo was shocked, and while looking at Pomerian, he asked Vicar if by mother he meant his daughter Penelope. While he was holding the pendant and looking at Pomerian, he began to tremble. Upon seeing this, Vicar started to feel happy and wished for Hugo to be even more confused. While trembling, Hugo began to stand up. Vicar thought to himself that Pomerian was a girl whose blood was mixed with someone Hugo loved and something he despised. He approached Pomerian and began to look at her, creating tension in the atmosphere. Vicar started to wonder if the great Hugo would be able to remain calm in front of his granddaughter. Pomerian looked into Hugo's eyes and began to feel fear and tremble. With a murderous gaze and aura, Hugo asked Vicar if the fact that she was found in Lakoko meant that she was the daughter of his daughter and a barbarian. Vicar stared at him intently, with shining eyes, and replied that his assumption was correct. Upon hearing this, Hugo began to tremble with anger and despair. His pulse was shaking as he slowly reached his hand towards Pomerian's head. Vicar stared intensely at Hugo, savoring the moment, knowing that once he had been ruined, his revenge plan would begin. Several hours later, in the main house garden, Vicar and Osiris met up with Barrymore. When they saw what their eyes were witnessing, they were left in shock. In front of them was Pomerian sitting on Hugo's lap. She grabbed his beard. He asked her if it was funny to pull his beard. She smiled and addressed Hugo as her grandfather and replied that his beard was very dirty. Upon hearing the word grandfather from Pomerian's mouth, he asked her if she had really just called him grandfather. Vicar simply stood there looking without saying a word. But instead, Osiris explained to them that even though he hadn't lived for a long time, this was the first time he had felt so surprised. Barrymore touched his glasses and told them that despite having lived for a long time, he shared the same thoughts as Vice Patriarch Osiris now. While Vicar was looking at Hugo and Pomerian, he began to wonder what was happening and why the Hugo he knew was suddenly changing. While Pomerian was eating a lollipop, Hugo put a hand on his face and started thinking that he was a grandfather. He couldn't help but cry at the thought that the day would come when they would call him grandfather. Seeing Hugo crying, Vicar became somewhat confused and surprised at the same time. He looked down at the floor and started sweating, and with a worried expression he began to wonder why Hugo Baskerville had that expression on his face. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part, don't forget to subscribe and like the video.